So I wanted to conclude our section here concerning Epicurus and free will, as well as laying the grounds for the next video, which will be on applying Epicurean principles to our day-to-day lives, which I promise will be a lot more straightforward than this video. Also, as a side note, it might not be a totally stupid idea to watch the first video on Epicurus and free will, which I made some while ago, to get familiar with some core definitions from the free will debate at least. So while this video might be seen as a bit more technical, I could nonetheless say that at least for my part that I find it interesting, as Epicurus was such an instrumental figure in bringing this popular philosophical topic to light early on. And let's not forget that compared to Plato and Aristotle, Epicurus gets scant mention, especially in academia. In addition, let's not kid ourselves, that even when you consider more modern defenses of libertarian free will arguments concerning an indeterminacy in the brain as laying the groundwork for free action, this still remains highly topical and widely discussed in the literature. Take this achievement into consideration when at the time there was no consensus in Epicurus' timeline as to the brain even being the center of intelligence, nor us having anything near the detailed understanding of human anatomy and neuroscience that we are in possession of today. Although few of his works survive, it does seem reasonable nonetheless that Epicurus might have had an inclination to the understanding of the brain's importance to human functioning, which he would have been an early proponent of. We can view this as novel insight, since at the time, most Greeks, perhaps influenced by Greek philosophers such as Aristotle and Pythagoras, held to the prevailing belief that the heart was the primary organ for higher faculties of the mind. Quite the romantic notion, isn't it? There did, however, exist other early proponents of attributing higher human functioning to the brain, where we might here mention that of the Greek physicians Epicurus and Galen, who both had experiences with attributing symptoms of brain trauma to the detriment of human cognitive faculties in the brain. Galen was quite the buzzword in the town of Rome where he settled at the time, and even offered services to several emperors. Pulling it back to Epicurus and free will, we are now ready to give an outline of the topics we will discuss in this video. For starters, let's start at looking at Epicurus' position on incompatibilism and his notion of a volitional swerve in relation to determining free choices, as well as the relation to the work of Lucretius and Democritus. We will then touch upon in the very end some modern defenses of this position, relating indeterminacy in the brain with that of modern neuroscience. We will then touch upon in the very end some modern defenses of this position, relating indeterminacy in the brain with that of modern neuroscience. Now let's get started. We see some philosophical defenses of the naturalistic notion of the indeterminacy swerve of atoms as put forth by Epicurus in the works of the Roman poet and philosopher Lucretius. Given the high voluminous output stemming from Epicurus in his lifetime, it is unfortunate that so little material has been preserved of direct sources stemming from Epicurus himself, which would have undoubtedly involved more material on the free will problem. In any case, Lucretius puts forth a defense of free will, as defended by Epicurus, by appealing to the apparent sense of freedom which animals inhabit. To do this, he makes a defense of the sense of motion that animals engage in, through listing examples, among others an example of the horses busting through starting gates. He wants to give an account for the fact that animals are not merely some biological entities which are simply shoved around by external blows, where in this case they would have been fully determined by antecedent conditions, which in turn would negate free will. Rather, for Lucretius, animals have an innate ability to initiate motion according to their own accord or will. To give an account for this, he reckons that there is in existence a delay in terms of the translation into direct action, where before this action occurring, just like the horses must instantiate a desire to move forward when the gates are opened, along with waiting for a swerve to occur, so it is with human beings and their instantiation of motion. Epicurus himself was also preoccupied with motion, who in turn tied the concept of motion with that of a void. He makes, for instance, a positive claim to the existence of a void by claiming that if there was not indeed any void, then bodies would be completely restricted in terms of motion. Thus, we can infer that there must be an existence of a void from the positive existence of motion. Now, the viewer might be confused here as to the type of freedom both Lucretius and Epicurus endorses, because doesn't it sound rather minimal here? Relating the previous part concerning freedom in regards to direct motion, that's not exactly the type of freedom which concerns our modern understanding of the free will dilemma. Rather, we often hear talk about freedom to act accordingly in often deeper questions involving moral responsibility or in terms of human dignity, accompanied with a preponderance and deliberation. Questions of the form, is it moral to do X, or should I choose to do some other action than X, or perform the given action with long-term consequences, easily spring to mind as candidate questions. Contrast this with the type of freedom which Lucretius puts forward following an Epicurean heritage, which essentially concerns the freedom to be an effective agent, to move about in the world following some initial desire. I have to say that this strikes me as a rather salient point, if I may say so, that the type of freedom libertarians share and espouse is in fact far removed from the type of freedom that is important for Epicureans, which obviously is a less ambitious form of free will. Thus, in order to properly understand Epicurean free will, we're going to have to get used to the idea that this is very much rooted in a larger, grander system of an atomistic worldview where notions of determinism and indeterminism are often intertwined. In addition to this, Epicurus most certainly would have been acquainted with the teachings of Aristotle, which includes, among others, his famous Nicomachean Ethics, where we find writings dealing explicitly with the voluntary action of free will. Let's take Nicomachean Ethics Book 3 as an example, where, to quote, Aristotle says that, unlike non-rational agents, we have the power to do or not to do, and much of what we do is voluntary, such that its origin is in us and we are aware of the particular circumstances of the action. It's worth pointing out here, however, that while there may be some commonality in addressing the concept of free action between the two, Epicurus would have rejected Aristotle's conception of objects having essences that defines its purpose as well as defining its identity, and thus obviously rejecting the Aristotelian philosophy of teleology. As Epicurus was defined by the view of atomism, he therefore rejected the view that one could not give a reductive explanation in terms of the properties which it is constituted by. Human beings, for instance, which he claimed possessed free will, came about prior to their having explicit functions and could be given a proper account in terms of their atomic constituent parts. I won't delve any further on this relationship between the two here, but we will make a return later in the video to talk about the influence of Democritus, which we have to say obviously had a strong influence for Epicurus, seeing that he founded the school of atomism. Now let's get back to our man Lucretius, where we note, following the strong historical pedigree of Aristotelian logic in both ancient Greek and more modern life, he gives the following argument in favor of free will, which can really be taken to constitute a basic form of modus tollens. For clarity, I give the basic form here, where we deny the consequent. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Now let's get back to the argument. If atoms did not have a swerving motion, there would not be free action or free will. There is in existence free will, therefore the atoms do have a swerving motion. Notice from the second premise, which flat out states that free will is in existence, which obviously detractors of free will are going to deny. Therefore, Lucretius has, in attempting to prove the indeterminacy of the swerving action of atoms, already assumed a larger conclusion of a positive claim towards free will, which as it stands, anyone questioning this claim has no reason to be compelled to believe in the existence of atoms' swerving motion following Lucretius's argument. To be fair, he does provide to give some account for the existence of free will in addition to the apparent behavior he observes being in concordance with free will of animals. He makes, for instance, an appeal to human beings' ability to cognize, reflect, and reason, which through the exercise of such faculties as the consciousness of mind makes it possible to act in accordance with free will. In addition, he defends a position of humans not being completely undermined by external factors in the environment and society through a strong sense of agency. While I must admit that I find neither of those reasons particularly compelling, as they seem to be undermined by his own subjective intuitions and experiences in regards to beings being able to act freely, they are nonetheless an important historical entry point into the debate of the topic. His appeal to human consciousness as ensuring conditions of free will is still debated as an example. As to the first premise, it should be noted that we cannot assume that swerves are necessarily identical to volition. There may, for instance, be accounts, as defended by the position known as hard indeterminism, where we could imagine atomic swerves giving rise to indeterminacy without the entailment of free action. The argument here being that unpredictable movement and randomness or stochastic processes cannot be said to necessarily ensure that the underlying behavior is determined through free volitional states. To sum up then, Lucretius makes a mistake in making a direct comparison between volitions and swerves of atoms, claiming an equivalence. To quote, "Because the two are, at bottom, the same, and it is because our volitions are constituted by random swerves that our actions are likewise random, instead of being determined to occur at fixed times and places." Now, as I have previously mentioned, it is important to place Epicurean philosophy as having a deep inspiration stemming from the Greek philosopher and father of atomist metaphysics, known as Democritus. We will therefore here touch upon his role as an inspiration for Epicurus and his own formulation concerning free actions. One can also view Epicurus as making a commentary on the works of the former, as he made the contribution with the addition of swerving action to ensure the condition of freedom of action. Therefore, while both Epicurus and Democritus are atomists, the latter, according to Epicurus, takes things too far with his atomist eliminativist position, which he thinks does not give enough consideration of human volitional agency. For Democritus, on the other hand, he holds a very parsimonious or simplified ontology in which he asserts that all that exists for certain are atoms and void, whereby it is from the coming together of atoms in the void that gives in turn the rise of the various objects and phenomena that we observe in our universe. But remember, we have to be careful here, as it is not at all clear that thinkers like Lucretius and other Epicureans are in strict opposition to determinism on all accounts per se. Remember that the concept of freedom defended by Lucretius, for instance, relied on a freedom to initiate motion or action via deliberation, which can certainly be defended under determinism. For what would the counterpart to this be? To make all action and deliberation pointless surely would be one interpretation, such that since determinism only states that actions are determined via antecedent conditions, this is perfectly in line with the actor being able to instantiate his or her own emotions as the actor pleases. It's clear then that Epicurus's objection must be on a different ground, which is indeed the case, as Epicurus is afraid, as he sees it, of fatalist consequences stemming from the view of Democritus. Perhaps he means that if atoms really did instantiate all actions, without his proposal of the swerving of atoms, then could he mean that these actions were all predetermined to occur in advance of time? Hence, in this case, we would be powerless to do anything other than what we actually do, which describes the fatalist position. Epicurus could nonetheless be seen here as advocating for a reductionist view via his atomism, such that larger bodies are themselves composed of nothing more than atoms, and the further stronger claim that these larger bodies do not themselves contain any causal powers beyond those atoms. Furthermore, properties such as the ability to instantiate an action, or for that matter all properties, would according to Epicurus be determined by the relations between atoms. This gives in a sense a very reductive materialism, which in turn is widely held in today's popular philosophical climate. However, getting back to his particular view, this might seem strange for us taking into account our modern understanding of science, as it is really cells or multiple cells, such as those that compose neurons, that we would assume to be irrelevant when contemplating notions of free will from a neuroscientific perspective. This is something that a reductive materialist might, for instance, argue, whereas someone taking a more functionalist view might argue that it is the concerted interactions and the functional role of neurons that make a difference. In any case, in both cases, we are working with a larger scale than that of the atom, as we are talking about cells and their interactions. One could, however, in principle argue from a smaller scale, all the way down to subatomic particles, if it was shown that there exists quantum interactions in the brain, which at the present moment, as far as I understand, the majority of brain researchers do not think holds likely. In any case, it would be kind of fun if it turned out it was the case, as it would give some credence back to the atomists running back in time all the way back to ancient Greece. So, to sum up this portion of the video, then we could say that while Epicurus plants his foot firmly in the atomist camp, what separates him from Democritus is his insistence on a lesser form of reductionism involving his concept of a swerving action, which ensures the necessary volitional freedom according to Epicurus. Holding from his position that atoms are in a constant flux of motion, the swerving action ensures a slight perturbation or deviation in the trajectories of atoms. This in turn upsets his original notion of all atoms moving in a straight line, where according to him, under these conditions, everything would be easily determined and predictable, leading to the upsetting fatalist conclusion previously discussed. We end here by giving an argument again in modern Toland's form for the existence of the swerving action given by Lucretius. The argument may be stated as follows: if the atoms did not swerve, there would be no collisions and no macroscopic bodies. There are collisions and macroscopic bodies, thus the atoms swerve. Here one possible interpretation can be seen as making a plea for some temporal starting point at which there were no collisions, so it then follows that a collision must have occurred in order to get the chain rolling, so to speak, to ensure the many collisions which we witness occurring at present. Note also here that it's really the first premise which sticks out as controversial, as under what obligation should we accept that there would be no collisions and no macroscopic bodies if it were not for the swerving of atoms? Now let's introduce the last section of the video, where we will discuss more modern resemblances in defense of a libertarian free will position, which keeps some continuity, or at the very least a tradition, with Epicurus's idea of a swerving action of indeterminacy. There is, for instance, a position defended by the American neuroscientist Peter Ulrich Say, who exploits the complex system of causality that exists in the brain in order to give a defense of the libertarian position, while at the same time retaining physicalism as a position. His argument rests upon what he calls a criterion causation of will, where he argues that it is possible for the brain to determine how it will behave given particular types of future inputs. To do this, he relies on, among others, on what he calls criterial decoder schemes, in the sense that they wait to receive relevant input, which meets some previously set up criteria. These criterial decoders come about through altering weights of synapses, rapid or in dynamic fashion, or alternatively using mechanisms such as long-term potentiation. To give a nice summary of his view, we can quote the author himself. Criteria can be set up in advance such that when they are met, an action automatically follows. This is an action that we will have willed to take place by virtue of having set up those particular criteria in advance. At the moment those criteria are satisfied at some unknown point in the future, leading to some action or choice, those criteria cannot be changed, but because criteria can be changed in advance, we are free to determine how we will behave within certain limits in the near future. This variability of outcomes that Say proposes also has its roots in randomness and bears a metaphoric resemblance to the swerving action defended by Epicurus himself. We may then ask what exactly these sources of randomness really are. Say, for instance, makes an appeal to the complex interactions in the brain, where some of these include the following. Number 1, multiple possible outcomes which are due to the variability caused by neurotransmitter diffusion across the synapse. Number 2, randomness occurring due to the magnesium ion behaviors amplified by NMDA receptor openings. Number 3, other sources of randomness occurring in spike time intervals. The above list may then be said to constitute arguments in favor of indeterminism, which is then following Say's approach of free will coupled with a determination phase decided by ourselves, thereby making the decision in some sense up to us. There are, of course, other avenues of arguments one may explore with a leniency on neuroscience, such as an appeal to the role of consciousness in supporting free will, or an appeal to the emergent properties that stem from a collective activity of the brain. But the point here was just to showcase some tradition in reference to Epicurean philosophy. It's, as always, important to realize that there really aren't any knockdown arguments given in philosophy, which means that of course other people have given critiques of the views put forth here, meaning that one should be careful when assessing arguments in either side by carefully evaluating strengths and weaknesses of differing views. I also might be tempted to make some videos in the future concerning free will, where I look at more contemporary arguments stemming from different positions. Who knows? In any case, that concludes the video, where we, to summarize, have looked at Epicurus's and Lucretius's formulation and theory regarding the swarming motion of atoms as a proposal for a free will mechanism, clarification for what is meant by free will in the context of Epicurean philosophy, Democritus's influence in regards to Epicurus, and finally modern approaches in support of free will with a semblance of tradition towards Epicurus. So yeah, please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, feel free to throw them in as well. I will be back next week for the now final chapter in the philosophy pertaining to Epicurus, so that should be fun.